He paraded his young lover during our divorce, but I was already planning my revenge. The living room was cold, not because of the weather, but because of the silence between them. He stood there, casually throwing his tie over the back of a chair, while she remained seated, holding the divorce papers he had left carelessly on the kitchen counter. There was no apology, no hesitation. "You're not the woman I married anymore," he said, eyes fixed on his phone as if her pain didn't matter. "I need someone who matches my energy. Someone younger. You've let yourself go, and frankly, I'm tired of pretending." Those words echoed in her ears, louder than any argument they had in years. After 2 decades of building a life together, sacrificing her career, raising their children, and supporting his every whim, he discarded her like she was some outdated accessory. She watched as he walked out, his cologne still lingering in the air, mixing with the bitterness that now filled her lungs. On the hallway mirror, her reflection stared back at her, tired eyes, soft lines from laughter long forgotten, and hair that hadn't seen a stylist in months. He didn't just file for divorce. He replaced her. And not quietly. His new lover, barely out of college, was now the centerpiece of his social media feeds. Dinners, vacations, luxury weekends, they flaunted their affair like a new brand launch. She had become invisible. But beneath the humiliation and abandonment, something stirred in her. A fire, slow and deep, beginning to burn. It was supposed to be a simple family gathering. His parents had invited everyone over to keep things cordial, as they said. But as she entered the room, all eyes turned, not with warmth, but with awkward pity. And then they saw him, laughing at the table, arm wrapped around the young woman who used to be his assistant. The same girl she had once invited into their home for dinner. "Oh, you actually came," the girl chuckled, looking her up and down. "How brave of you." Her ex-husband didn't even flinch. "She insisted on attending," he said, casually sipping wine. "But we've all moved on, haven't we?" As laughter followed, something in her cracked. Not a sob, not a shout, just a quiet shift. She sat down, silent, enduring every veiled insult, every whispered comment. "She aged so fast," someone muttered. "I guess some people aren't built for longevity." Even the children seemed uncomfortable, unsure of who to support. She smiled politely, her hands trembling beneath the table. What none of them knew was that she had already started keeping notes. Every moment, every insult, every display of cruelty, it was all being stored, not for vengeance, but for clarity. The clarity that would soon shape her next move. At night, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the silence pressing against her like a weight. She thought back to the early years, the nights she stayed up sewing Halloween costumes, the mornings she made breakfast before he left for meetings. She had given everything, her time, her youth, her ambition. Once an honors graduate with dreams of opening her own design firm, she had put it all aside when their first child came along. He said they couldn't afford a nanny, and she agreed, thinking it was love. But now, with every memory replaying in her mind, she realized it had been convenience for him, not devotion. She remembered how she used to sketch at night, just for herself, while he snored beside her. The designs were raw, full of emotion, but they were never shown to anyone. "This is just a hobby," he once said, brushing aside her notebook with his sleeve. She had laughed it off then. Now it burned. That laughter had been the start of her silencing. All the moments she bit her tongue, all the times she prioritized his career, they weren't sacrifices anymore, they were warnings ignored. But as she sat by the fireplace, flipping through her old sketchbooks, she didn't feel regret. She felt something else. The beginning of a comeback. The house felt unfamiliar now. Every corner whispered a version of her life that no longer existed. The kitchen still held the scent of meals she used to cook for a man who no longer sat at the head of the table. The bedroom remained untouched since the day he left, with drawers half empty and the mirror collecting dust. It was as though time had paused, leaving her to exist in a museum of a marriage that had died long before the divorce papers arrived. She spent days in her robe, barely eating, watching her phone light up with pictures of him and the girl, laughing, traveling, living. The ache was constant. But worse than the sadness was the shame. She couldn't face anyone. The neighbors offered empty smiles. Her friends, unsure of what to say, stopped calling. Her own children, busy with their lives, didn't see how their mother was unraveling behind polite messages. Once, she tried to go to the grocery store, only to overhear a conversation in the aisle. "She really let herself go," a woman whispered. "No wonder he left." That night, she collapsed on the bathroom floor, gripping the edges of the sink, tears running silently. It was her lowest point. But in that stillness, something else began to grow. She didn't know it yet, but she was starting to build a version of herself that no one could break again. It came on a Tuesday afternoon, buried among promotional emails and online receipts. The subject line read, "Long time, no see." She almost deleted it, assuming it was spam. But then she saw the name, Hannah, her roommate from college. They hadn't spoken in over a decade, but there it was, a simple message filled with warmth. "I've thought about you so often. I saw your name pop up on LinkedIn and couldn't resist reaching out. We're organizing a reunion for our class. Would love to see you again." For a moment, she hesitated. What would she say? What would they think of her now? But then she realized something. These were people who knew her before the marriage, before the sacrifices, before she forgot who she was. Maybe she needed that reminder. She responded with a short, nervous yes. As the days passed, she began to prepare. Not just her appearance, but her confidence. She went through her closet, tried on old clothes, practiced her smile in the mirror. The woman she used to be wasn't gone, she was buried under layers of pain and compromise. And now, for the first time in years, she was ready to start digging herself out. The day of the reunion drew closer, and so did her doubts. She stood in front of the mirror for the first time in months, not to brush her hair or put on makeup, but simply to really look. The face staring back was familiar yet unfamiliar. There were new lines near her eyes, the result of years without rest, and a quiet sorrow in her gaze that hadn't been there before. But there was also resilience, a quiet strength carved from everything she'd endured. With trembling fingers, she applied a touch of foundation, not to impress anyone, but to remind herself she still mattered. As she zipped up a navy blue dress that had been gathering dust at the back of her closet, she barely recognized the woman in the mirror. But something inside her whispered that this wasn't a stranger, it was her, reborn. She stepped back, adjusted the collar, and let her hair fall naturally over her shoulders. There were no drastic changes, just small affirmations. A hint of lipstick. A modest necklace. She didn't need to prove anything to anyone. This wasn't about revenge, not yet. It was about reclaiming the woman she had forgotten in the rush of life. The mirror didn't lie. She was still here. The reunion hall was filled with music, laughter, and echoes of the past. She walked in slowly, unsure of how she would be received. Old classmates buzzed in clusters, comparing jobs, children, and life milestones. She felt like a ghost drifting between timelines. Then a voice called her name, soft, surprised, but warm. It was Hannah, just as vibrant as she remembered, with a hug that felt like home. "You look amazing," she said, genuinely. "I wasn't sure you'd come." That single comment cracked the shell of fear she had built around herself. She didn't feel like a discarded ex-wife anymore. She felt seen. As the evening progressed, more familiar faces appeared, and so did the memories. People asked what she had been up to. She didn't lie, but she didn't shrink either. "I'm in transition," she said. "Learning to prioritize myself again." Some nodded with empathy, others offered job tips or contacts. One man, Ian, who had been top of their class in business school, paused after hearing her speak. "You were always sharp," he said. "If you're ever looking to get back into the game, let me know. We're expanding our team." She smiled politely, not quite ready to believe such doors could open again, but the seed had been planted. The drive home felt different that night. There was no weight on her chest, no tears pooling behind her eyes. Instead, there was curiosity. Possibility. She thought of Ian's words, the way people had genuinely cared about her stories, not as an extension of her husband's shadow, but as someone whole. That feeling clung to her long after the engine turned off. She walked inside, slipped off her heels, and instead of collapsing into bed, she opened a notebook. It had been years since she sketched anything. Her hands trembled slightly as the pencil moved, but soon, the rhythm returned. Shapes, lines, color palettes, ideas, long buried, came rushing back like old friends. By the time the clock struck midnight, her kitchen table was covered in sketches. She stood over them, arms crossed, quietly satisfied. They weren't perfect, but they were hers. She felt something awaken, something that hadn't stirred since before the children were born, before she started answering to someone else's schedule. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe her story didn't end with betrayal. Maybe, just maybe, this was where it began. That night, she didn't cry. She didn't replay his words. She simply worked, and for the first time in years, she felt alive. A few days later, her phone buzzed with an unknown number. She hesitated before answering, only to hear Ian's voice on the other end. "I meant what I said," he began. "We're recruiting project consultants for a short-term creative strategy job. It's contract-based, but it could be a good way to test the waters again." Her heart jumped. Fear crept in almost immediately. What if she wasn't ready? What if she failed? But somewhere deeper, a flicker of boldness answered. "Send me the details," she said calmly, despite the storm building inside her. After hanging up, she sat in silence, staring at her phone, letting the reality of the moment settle. Later that night, she reviewed the project description, brand revamping for a boutique retail firm. She understood the jargon, the expectations, the tools. It was familiar, like riding a bike after years off the seat. She updated her resume, hesitant at first, then with purpose. Her fingers flew over the keyboard, not stopping for doubt. There were years of gaps she couldn't hide, but there were also decades of silent wisdom she could now voice. She submitted everything just before midnight. No grand speeches. No second-guessing. Just a quiet return to herself. Her first day on the job arrived with a mix of excitement and dread. She walked into the modern office dressed in confidence, nothing extravagant, just crisp lines and neutral tones that whispered quiet authority. But the stares began almost instantly. Most of the staff were half her age, buzzing with startup energy, typing loudly, talking fast. She heard a young voice murmur behind her, "Is she someone's mom?" followed by a chuckle. She didn't respond. Not with words, anyway. Instead, she sat down, pulled out her notes, and began preparing for the team meeting. It wasn't about proving herself to them. It was about proving something to the woman who had once forgotten her worth. The meeting was brisk. The manager introduced her with barely a glance. "She'll be assisting with brand review," he said, before launching into numbers and timelines. She offered a few suggestions, each met with silence. At one point, a junior designer interrupted her mid-sentence. "We've tried that already," he said, dismissively. She nodded, jotted down her thoughts, and waited. She wasn't there to be liked. She was there to deliver. And if no one was ready to listen yet, that was fine. Because soon, they would have no choice. The second week brought more silence than support. Her contributions were met with forced smiles or quick redirections. During coffee breaks, conversations died the moment she approached. In team chats, her name was skipped when praise was given. "She's too old school," someone whispered in the elevator, not realizing she was right behind them. Each word hit like ice on skin, but she didn't flinch. She remembered similar whispers when she first quit her job to raise her children, how they said she'd never return to the industry. Back then, she believed them. This time, she didn't. Rather than shrinking, she watched. Listened. Took notes. She started noticing things the younger team overlooked: flaws in branding alignment, missed audience cues, inconsistency in design language. At home, she stayed up late refining her proposals, carefully constructing feedback that didn't just point out problems, but brought real solutions. She didn't try to prove anything during meetings anymore. She let her work speak. She knew silence could be weaponized, but also that silence, when deliberate, could command more respect than noise. On a rainy Wednesday afternoon, she submitted a revised brand strategy proposal directly to the senior manager. It was thorough, forward-thinking, and subtly addressed many of the overlooked mistakes the team had been repeating. She didn't expect an immediate reply. But later that evening, as she was preparing dinner, her phone buzzed. The message was brief but powerful: "Impressive work. Let's discuss this next week. Eric." It was the first time anyone in leadership acknowledged her directly. She didn't smile, didn't celebrate. She simply closed her eyes and breathed deeply, letting the validation sink into the spaces that once held self-doubt. The next day, there was a slight shift. One of the junior analysts approached her desk. "Hey, I read your notes. That part about the brand voice, really smart." It wasn't a grand moment. It was small, hesitant, but it was a crack in the wall. She replied with a quiet thanks, not feeding into it. The change she wanted wasn't applause. It was momentum. And it was starting. She continued working, calmly and consistently. Not chasing recognition, but earning it inch by inch, quietly reclaiming the professional respect she had once surrendered without realizing. By the third week, the tone in the office began to shift. People no longer looked through her, they looked at her. In meetings, her comments were met with thoughtful nods. During one presentation, the marketing director paused, turned to her, and asked for her opinion directly. "You've seen more of this than we have," he said. That phrase, simple as it was, landed with unexpected weight. Experience. The very thing they once used to exclude her was now being called upon for insight. She gave her opinion with clarity and precision, grounding every thought in data and purpose. Later that day, a design intern approached her sheepishly, holding a notebook. "Do you mind reviewing my layout? I'd really like your feedback." She agreed without hesitation. That night, she worked on her own presentation deck, one that would pitch a full rebranding concept. It was risky, bold even. But she had learned that staying small didn't protect you. It just made you easier to overlook. This time, she would speak loudly, not with volume, but with value. Her phone rang the morning of her birthday, just as she was stirring sugar into her coffee. It was him. Her ex-husband's name flashed on the screen like a ghost from another life. She hesitated, then answered. "Happy birthday," he said with that same amused tone he always used when pretending to be kind. "I hope you're enjoying your new internship?" She didn't correct him. "I am," she replied simply, letting his sarcasm die in the silence. He kept talking, bragging about a new property, his girlfriend's latest trip to Italy, how relaxed his life had become. "Freedom suits me," he added with a smug laugh. Before hanging up, he left her with one final jab. "But really, good for you. Staying busy at your age is important." "I mean that." She stared at the wall, the phone still warm in her hand. His voice no longer had the power to freeze her. In fact, it amused her, how desperate he was to remain superior in a race she'd stopped running. She placed the phone down gently and returned to her notes. She had a presentation to prepare, one that could change everything. She didn't expect to see them. Not that day, not in that place. But as she entered the small cafe near the office, there they were, her ex-husband and the young woman he had left her for, sitting by the window, laughing over coffee. He saw her before she could turn away. "Well, well," he said loudly, enough for nearby tables to hear. "Didn't expect to see you here, working woman." The girl giggled and added, "You're still doing that office thing? That's cute." Her stomach twisted, but she didn't show it. "Yes," she said, placing her order calmly. "It's going better than expected." She turned to leave when the girl leaned forward, mocking. "I saw your name on the website. You're just support staff, right? I thought you had more ambition than that." Without changing her tone, she looked back and said, "I'm exactly where I need to be. But thank you for reminding me why I left the past behind." The smile on her face didn't waver as she exited the cafe, but inside, a storm brewed. It wasn't anger, it was focus. She was tired of surviving. It was time to rise. Back at the office, she intensified her work on a confidential pitch, one quietly assigned to her by the senior manager after noticing her growing influence. It was a high-stakes project, rebranding an entire retail chain struggling with identity crisis. She spent late nights cross-analyzing trends, behaviors, and emotional anchors in customer loyalty. Her approach wasn't flashy. It was grounded, intuitive, and detailed in ways others hadn't dared attempt. While the younger team scrambled to impress with aesthetics, she focused on essence. Her years of life experience weren't baggage, they were the very lens needed to reconnect the brand with real people. The only catch? She wasn't allowed to talk about the project until final approval. So, while others in the office bragged about their assignments, she remained quiet, observing their shallow strategies with a knowing smile. At home, her kitchen table turned into a war room, covered with mock-ups, mood boards, and handwritten notes. Every piece was crafted with care, every decision weighed with empathy. This wasn't just a project. It was a silent declaration that she was no longer invisible. She was building something that would make the world, and those who once dismissed her, take notice. Everything seemed to be flowing until she received an email with a list of names involved in the upcoming investor review. Her breath caught. One name stood out: Anthony Shaw. He was not just a lead investor, he was also the older brother of her ex-husband's girlfriend. Years ago, she had met him at a dinner party, where he had casually asked if she felt threatened by his sister's youth. The man was cold, calculated, and loyal only to appearances. Now, he'd be judging her pitch. She knew it wouldn't be fair. He wouldn't look at her work without bias. He wouldn't see a professional. He would see a discarded ex-wife. The day of the internal preview, Anthony entered the boardroom with that same half-smile she remembered. "Didn't expect to see a familiar face here," he said smoothly. "How's post-divorce life treating you?" The others in the room chuckled politely, unsure how to react. She simply replied, "Better than expected," and opened her presentation with quiet authority. For the next 30 minutes, she spoke with clarity, depth, and purpose. She didn't flinch once. She watched his smug grin tighten with every slide, as her proposal revealed insights the firm hadn't even considered. When it ended, there was a pause, heavy, uncertain. And then, polite applause. She had survived the first blow. The day after her presentation, something felt off. The junior designer, one of the louder voices in the office who had always dismissed her ideas, was suddenly called into the director's office. Hours later, he uploaded to the shared drive a revised proposal for the brand strategy. As she opened the file, her chest tightened. Slide after slide mirrored her own work, phrasing, diagrams, even the emotional pitch narrative. It was a shameless copy, only dressed in flashier visuals. He had stolen her concept, made minor tweaks, and tried to pass it off as his own. Anger burned in her throat, but she didn't scream. She took screenshots. She organized timestamps. And she waited. She walked calmly to the manager's office with evidence in hand. She didn't need to plead. She presented the truth, facts layered with professionalism. "This work was not his," she said, placing the files on the desk. "Here is the original trail." The manager's face darkened as he flipped through the documentation. Later that afternoon, an email was sent to the entire department. The junior designer had been dismissed for ethical misconduct. No further details were shared, but the silence that followed was louder than any apology. She had defended herself, not through anger, but through unshakable clarity. She didn't just protect her name. She solidified her presence. Following the incident, she noticed a difference in the way people looked at her. There was less arrogance, more caution, maybe even admiration. The project was reassigned to her exclusively, with full control over execution and implementation. Her insights were now included in executive summaries, her voice sought in decisions beyond branding. It was as if the moment she stopped needing validation, it arrived organically. She no longer lingered in the corners of meetings. She sat at the table. She leaned in. Her words weren't suggestions, they were directives. Her resilience had carved a place no title could have offered her before. Weeks passed, and the project neared launch. Clients praised the clarity of the rebrand, noting how it felt authentic, mature, and unexpectedly human. Her fingerprints were all over it, yet she remained gracious. "It was a team effort," she said publicly. But those who had once mocked her now knew who had carried the vision. During one strategy review, the marketing director smiled and said, "We could use someone like you in leadership, you know." She thanked him, not with desperation, but with dignity. Because she finally understood, her value was no longer a question to be asked, it was an answer already known. Late one Friday evening, as she was organizing the last pieces of the campaign, she received an envelope at her desk. No sender. Just her name in neat handwriting. Inside was a formal invitation to speak at the National Branding and Identity Conference, a panel reserved for industry leaders. At first, she thought it was a mistake. But the note inside made it clear, her project had caught attention, and she was being asked to present it herself. Her breath caught. The conference would be attended by executives, designers, investors, and by sheer coincidence, it was being coordinated by none other than her ex-husband's girlfriend, now a rising PR strategist. She reread the invitation twice before placing it on her desk. The irony didn't sting, it empowered her. She wouldn't attend for revenge. She would attend for the same reason she accepted that first contract, to reclaim her place, her purpose. That night, she stared out the window, the city lights blinking in rhythm with her heart. For so long, she had survived in silence. But now, her voice was being requested, on stage, under lights, in front of those who once saw her as irrelevant. And this time, she would not whisper. She would speak. The weeks leading up to the conference passed quickly. Between preparing for the panel and finalizing the rebranding launch, her days became a blur of rehearsals and meetings. Yet in the quiet hours of the night, anxiety still crept in. What if they remembered her only as someone's ex-wife? What if all her work was overshadowed by whispers and stares? She fought those thoughts the only way she knew how, by preparing relentlessly. She rewrote her speech again and again, not to impress, but to be understood. Her goal wasn't applause. It was clarity. Her story didn't need embellishment. It needed truth. When the day arrived, she stood in front of the mirror again, not like the first time, when she was uncertain and fractured, but now with presence. The dress she wore was simple, elegant, and chosen for herself. No need for armor, no need to hide. Arriving at the conference, she walked past banners and displays featuring her face and name. It still felt surreal. But as she stepped backstage and looked out at the growing crowd, she reminded herself, this wasn't luck. It was earned through humiliation, heartbreak, and perseverance. She wasn't here by chance. She belonged. As she stepped onto the stage, her eyes immediately met a familiar pair, sitting in the front row, dressed in curated glamour, was the woman who had once mocked her at a cafe, now coordinator of the event. Their eyes locked just briefly, but in that single glance, she saw discomfort. The smugness that once colored the younger woman's expressions was gone, replaced by tension. The microphone hummed. The lights softened. And then, she began. Her words were not rehearsed lines but honest, powerful reflections, on being dismissed, on starting over, on rediscovering strength in the most unexpected places. But as her talk concluded and the moderator opened the floor for questions, the young woman stood. Some people say experience is just another word for being outdated, she said with a tight smile. How do you respond to that in such a fast-evolving industry? The crowd hushed. Her heart pounded, but she smiled. Experience isn't a weakness, it's a lens, she replied. It's what helps you see what trends miss. It's how you build things that last. And it's why I'm not here to follow noise, I'm here to create clarity. The applause that followed wasn't explosive, but it was steady and deeply earned. The younger woman sat down, her expression unreadable. After the panel, people lined up to speak with her. Some praised her insights. Others shared how they had experienced similar journeys, restart careers, second acts, silent climbs back from invisibility. One young woman nervously asked, "How do you keep going when no one takes you seriously?" She leaned in gently. "You don't wait to be taken seriously," she said. "You act seriously. Eventually, the world catches up." As the crowd thinned, a familiar figure approached. It was her ex-husband. He looked older now. Thinner. His once confident posture seemed forced, as if trying to reclaim something he had lost. "You were incredible up there," he said, eyes scanning her face. "I never imagined." "I mean, wow." She simply nodded. "Thank you." He hesitated, then added, "Things haven't exactly been easy lately." She looked at him, the man who once told her she was too old, too dull, too irrelevant. "I hope you find your balance again," she said calmly. And then she turned to leave. He stood there, watching her walk away, not because he wanted her back, but because, for the first time, he understood what he had given up. Not a housekeeper. Not a mother. But a woman who had become unbreakable. Days later, her phone buzzed with a request for an interview. One of the top business publications wanted to feature her story as part of a series on resilience and transformation. She hesitated, unsure if she was ready to lay her journey bare to the public. But after rereading the message, she accepted. The interview took place in a quiet cafe, far from the polished floors of conference centers. The journalist was young, curious, and surprisingly respectful. "What made you come back after everything?" he asked. She stirred her tea before answering. "Because silence stopped feeling like peace. It started feeling like erasure." The article published days later with the title, Rewritten, How a Woman Reclaimed Her Voice After Being Replaced. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cruel. It was honest. It spoke of the early pain, the slow rebuild, and the eventual rise, not as revenge, but as rebirth. And slowly, messages began pouring in. Women from across the country, in their 40s, 50s, and beyond, reached out. Some had given up careers. Others were fighting to be seen. Her story lit something in them, not because it was extraordinary, but because it was real. She wasn't a hero. She was proof that it was never too late to begin again. Opportunities came quickly after the article. Speaking events. Consulting roles. But one offer stood out, a position as co-founder in a new firm aimed at empowering professionals over 40 returning to the workforce. It was exactly the kind of purpose-driven mission she had once dreamed of. She accepted with quiet pride, knowing it wasn't a step forward, it was a leap into legacy. The office was modest, but filled with energy. Women who had been invisible for too long now sat at desks, laptops open, sharing ideas that had been buried for years. She watched them with a full heart. One afternoon, as she sat in her new glass-walled office, she received a letter from her son. A real, handwritten letter. "Mom," it began, "I never realized how strong you were. But now I see it. You've shown me what it means to rise after being pushed down. I'm proud of you. And I hope I grow into half the person you are." Tears filled her eyes, not from sadness, but from release. The girl who had once been replaced, humiliated, forgotten, she was gone. In her place stood a woman who had rebuilt herself, piece by piece, until she no longer needed to prove anything. She had arrived. The dinner table, once marked by silence and absence, now echoed with laughter. Her children, now grown, began visiting more often, seeking her wisdom not out of obligation, but out of genuine admiration. They asked about her work, her new company, even her thoughts on current trends. One evening, her daughter placed a hand over hers and said softly, "You're my role model now." That simple sentence brought tears to her eyes. For years, she had felt like a ghost in her own home. Now, she was being seen, not just as a mother, but as a woman of strength. At a family gathering, one of her nieces approached her with a school project about inspirational women. Without hesitation, she had chosen her. "You started over. You didn't give up." "That's powerful," the girl said. Surrounded by generations that had once overlooked her, she realized the greatest gift she had given wasn't just resilience, it was visibility. She was showing the women around her that transformation doesn't belong to the young. It belongs to the brave. While cleaning out an old drawer, she found a weathered envelope addressed in her ex-husband's handwriting. It had been written during the early days of their separation and forgotten behind paperwork. The words inside were sharp, dismissive, cruel. "You won't survive without me," it said. "You're too soft. You'll fade." She sat with it for a moment, not with sadness, but with clarity. He had written it to wound her. At the time, it probably would have. Now, it only confirmed how far she had come. She didn't crumble. She didn't fade. She rose. She folded the note neatly and placed it back inside the envelope, not to keep the pain, but to honor the contrast. It reminded her that doubt can be a gift when it's used as fuel. That letter had once been meant as a closing statement. Now, it was nothing more than a page in a book she had rewritten. She tucked it away, not in shame, but in triumph. A relic of who she used to be, and the proof of who she had become. She was attending a networking event downtown when she saw him again. Her ex-husband, alone this time. His appearance had changed, grayer, thinner, his suit less polished. He approached slowly, no longer with arrogance, but hesitation. "I heard about your company," he said. "It's everywhere. Congratulations." She smiled politely. "Thank you." He lingered for a moment, eyes searching. "I didn't treat you right," he finally admitted. "And now, I don't even know where I stand." There was no bitterness in her. Just distance. "You were part of my story," she said gently. "But I had to let that story go to find myself." He nodded, quietly defeated. "Do you think we could talk sometime?" She looked at him, not unkindly, but firmly. "I hope you find peace. But my life has moved forward. I'm not meant to walk backward." She turned and left, not in haste, but with dignity. Her closure had come, not from him, but from within. As her company flourished, she began mentoring women going through similar transitions: divorce, job loss, midlife reinventions. Each had a story shaped by shame, doubt, or fear. She listened, guided, and shared pieces of her journey, not to impress, but to offer proof that the climb was possible. The office became more than a business, it became a safe haven. A place where being over 40 was no longer a liability, but a strength. She was invited to universities, panels, and think tanks to speak not only about branding, but about resilience. She always began the same way: "I wasn't always this woman. I had to lose everything I thought made me valuable to discover what really did." Those words struck something deep in her audiences. It wasn't the perfect life people needed to hear about. It was the imperfect journey, full of detours, loss, and the courage to start again, that truly moved hearts. Years later, she stood in her new office, now located in the heart of the city. The skyline stretched wide through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Her name was engraved on the door, not in gold, but in clean, simple lettering that mirrored her character, strong, understated, and steady. She watched a younger team pass through the hallway, some fresh out of school, others just finding their footing after years of being unseen. And in their faces, she saw herself. The version that had once been told she was too late, too old, too ordinary. She smiled, picked up a sketch from her desk, one of her early concepts, and framed it. Not because it was brilliant, but because it marked the moment she had chosen not to disappear. As she looked out over the city, her reflection caught in the glass, she felt no need for applause. She had nothing left to prove. The world hadn't handed her a comeback. She had built it, quietly, defiantly, beautifully. The woman once humiliated and left behind had not just survived, she had soared.